Thank you very much, Cal, and good evening, everyone. I want to thank Angela, Pat Cuneo, the Jefferson Society for hosting this event. There are many friends here in this room, Bernie Agresti for many years, Judge Agresti, Judge Stephanie, lots of Duquesners here. I really do want to thank Cal. He has done a magnificent job for the Historical Society at the Hagen History Center. He's a good friend and colleague. And I want to thank all of the folks who've put in work for this. And Ferky, it's so great to be part of this, and Pam Parker. It's also really nice to have Tom Hagen himself here, hiding in the back. He's like one of the bad students hiding toward the back of the room. We also saw Tom last night at a just beautiful event at the home of our prominent alum, Michael Victor, our law school alum, who hosted us last night. So, and Tom, again, thanks for all of your great vision and work for the community, for the arts, of which this is another great example. So when Cal first invited me to give this address, we decided, as he said, the most timely topic would be to talk about presidents, how they interface with the Constitution, but how specifically that might go awry in times of conflict. And so as Pat and Angela and I chatted further, we decided to refine the plan and to make it a little more relevant to what's going on in the country. We decided to get even more specific. So tonight I'm going to talk about a few presidential scandals and constitutional issues unleashed by them, starting with earlier history, particularly the Nixon and Clinton years, and then moving into the unprecedented array of criminal perils that have engulfed former President Donald Trump. For better or worse, this has somehow become one of my areas of expertise. I didn't set out to be a presidential scandals person. I wrote the biography of Archibald Cox, the Watergate special prosecutor who was my law professor at Harvard. By the time I got to Harvard in the late 70s, Cox was a national hero, having stood up to Richard Nixon during the Watergate crisis. So my book on Watergate and Cox came out in early 1998, just as the Monica Lewinsky scandal was exploding in the news. And so I became a talking head during the impeachment drama and moved unexpectedly into writing this book, The Death of American Virtue, Clinton versus Starr, which, as Cal said, was a New York Times bestseller, about those challenging times in U.S. history. And based on my Watergate work, I also began digging into the issue of President Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon and helped organize a few big programs on that subject around the country, including a really big one at the Chautauqua Institution, which I'm sure many of you have visited during the summers. Sadly, all of those crises in government seem to be dwarfed today by the events of the Trump presidency and post-presidency, which have brought presidential scandals and post-presidency scandals to a new level. So we decided it couldn't be more timely than to focus on that subject. So I have taught constitutional law for about 30 years. I'm editor of this book called The Presidents and the Constitution. There's a chapter on every president from Washington to the present. The paperback just came out this past year with a new Trump chapter in it. It's fascinating to look at all this through the lens of history. Stop and think about it. Article 2 of the Constitution that sets out the powers of the presidency barely contains 1,000 words. So the framers clearly knew that they were creating an office that wasn't fully defined, that had to be hashed out over time, with George Washington being the first, and they trusted him. But that has often produced crazy and even messy results. Over time, events of history have made heroes of or destroyed American presidents trying to implement or interpret to their advantage sometimes the sparse words of the Constitution. And inevitably, a variety of conflicts and scandals have erupted at unexpected moments of history. Some presidents have navigated and skated past these successfully and safely. Others are eaten alive by these controversies. So there have been plenty of efforts to sanction presidents for misbehavior as early as our second president, John Adams, a Federalist who was threatened with censure or impeachment. This is the second president of the United States for, in that case, thwarting the criminal justice system by handing over to Great Britain a man named Thomas Nash, the Thomas Nash affair. He was arrested in South Carolina for allegedly committing murder and mutiny on a British ship. And so he was sent back to Great Britain so that the American courts couldn't bring him to justice. And that was the basis of the complaints against Adams. Congressman, then John Marshall, later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, brilliantly defended Adams in Congress, arguing that the president, when it came time to foreign affairs, had sweeping powers. So Adams escaped removal, but he was swept out of office in 1800 after just one term. And as you may know, he was so humiliated that he snuck out of the nation's capital early in the morning of Thomas Jefferson's inauguration so he wouldn't have to witness it. Andrew Jackson then, the seventh president, was censured by the Whig Senate for directing the Secretary of Treasury to remove all of the federal deposits from the National Bank. He claimed, hey, I was elected on this. I have a mandate from the American people to abolish it. And so Jackson fiercely argued that the Senate had no constitutional power to censure him, and there's no provision in the Constitution about censure. He ultimately got that censure expunged in 1834 when the Democrats recaptured the Senate, but it still stung him. And then, of course, Andrew Johnson, Abe Lincoln's, I saw that beautiful little bust of Abe Lincoln that cost how much? $68 that you were given today. Andrew Johnson takes over after Lincoln is assassinated, came within a hair of being impeached for defying the Tenure of Office Act and standing in the way of Congress's Reconstruction efforts after the Civil War. And this effectively neutered him and caused him to lose the Democratic nomination in 1868. And then there was the Teapot Dome scandal. And we hear about it sometimes, often don't hear the details. Warren Harding, who succeeded President Woodrow Wilson by pledging a return to normalcy after World War I, was rocked by this scandal when it was revealed that his Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, had used his office to profit from fraudulent oil leases. And this led to the appointment of our nation's first special prosecutors, Owen Roberts, later a Supreme Court justice, and Atlee Pomerene, former senator from Ohio. There wasn't any evidence that linked Harding to Fall's fraudulent leases, but that didn't really absolve him. As Harding famously cursed to the newspapers, "I have no trouble with my enemies. It's my damn friends," he said. "They're the ones who keep me walking the floors at night." He went on an exhausting tour to inspect Alaska and died on his way back, ultimately worn out, literally, by the Teapot Dome scandal. But few presidents, of course, can ever match Richard M. Nixon for both glory and infamy. So I was asking Tom Hagen this question, but let's have a show of hands, because this is a rather youthful crowd. How many of you were alive during the events of Watergate? Okay, a couple of you at least. Well, we're gonna set the stage here, Angela, by having a vintage film clip to take you back to October of 1973. It's 50 years ago, can you believe that? During the darkest months of the Nixon presidency, when the wounds of Watergate, the wounds of the Vietnam War were still fresh, and the country was being consumed by this growing scandal called Watergate.
October 1973, the Senate has begun hearings investigating possible White House involvement in a burglary at the Watergate Hotel and a subsequent cover-up. The big question, what did the president know, and when did he know it? Investigators learn that President Nixon has made secret tapes of every conversation in his executive offices. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox has subpoenaed the Watergate tapes. And on October 20th, 1973, the stage is set for a political showdown unlike any in our history.
President Nixon has announced that he has discharged Archibald Cox, the Special Watergate Prosecutor, and abolished Cox's office. The Attorney General, Elliott Lee Richardson, has resigned. Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus has been fired. The shakeup is one virtually unparalleled in American history.
How could this be happening in the United States where the whole constitutional process is simply being wiped out?
It was clear that this was a watershed event in American history.
1 week earlier, October 12, 1973, Archibald Cox wins a court order demanding that the president surrender the Watergate tapes. Nixon has 1 week to comply or appeal to the Supreme Court. As the deadline approaches, there are a flurry of negotiations between Cox and the White House. James Doyle was his spokesman.
The paranoia level in our office among some of the attorneys was fairly high at this point, too. People thinking they're going to do something to us to make this case go away.
During that last week, the message that filtered down to the staff is that there was less legal discussions and more troublesome, threatening type of comments.
Monday, October 15th, Nixon and his chief of staff, Alexander Haig, come up with a scheme. Cox can't have the tapes, but he can have an edited transcript to be prepared by 72-year-old Senator John Stennis, and he can ask for no further evidence. Cox cannot accept the proposal. As Friday's 5 o'clock deadline draws near, a showdown seems inevitable. 5 o'clock comes and goes with no word from the White House. Finally, Cox gets a call at home from Nixon's Attorney General, Elliott Richardson. Cox cannot have the tapes, and he must not seek any further information from the White House. Saturday, October 20th. Fearing the president will get away with an obstruction of justice, Cox makes a difficult decision. He will hold a press conference and explain the implications of the case to America. In making his point, he uses a prophetic example.
A president can always work his will. You remember when Andrew Jackson wanted to take the deposits from the Bank of the United States, and his Secretary of the Treasury wouldn't do it, he fired him. And then he appointed a new Secretary of the Treasury, and he wouldn't do it, and he fired him. And finally, he got a third who would. And that's one way of proceeding.
Mr. Cox.
At the White House, Nixon and Haig have been trying to persuade Attorney General Richardson to fire Cox. They want him out of their hair. Richardson insists he has no legal grounds. Nixon and Haig offer some attractive inducements.
The various things that might appeal to me, like, for example, an ambassadorship, even perhaps London, if that were of interest. But on Saturday afternoon, this was escalated to the potential that I might be on the national ticket in 1976.
Richardson is adamant. Nixon gets tough.
Because of his refusal to carry out the president's policies, the Attorney General, Elliott Lee Richardson, has resigned. President Nixon has discharged Archibald Cox, the special Watergate prosecutor, and abolished Cox's office. Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus has been fired.
So the first thing was, you know, get your necktie on, get her jacket on, get down to the office. The FBI was there, and they had orders. They had sealed off the Attorney General's office. It really was unbelievable for this country.
There was considerable fear that the White House was attempting to orchestrate the purging of the investigative files.
FBI agents occupying the offices permit nothing to leave the premises.
But one of the things I had was a framed copy of the Declaration of Independence. And so I put it under my arm, tried to take it out the door. And the agent who was there, Angie Lano, he said to me, "Jim, you can't take anything home." I said, "Angie, it's the Declaration of Independence. Just stamp it void and let me take it home."
The immediate public reaction is called a firestorm. Almost every public office in Washington is swamped with telegrams and phone calls of support for Cox and his office. For Richard Nixon, the writing is on the wall.
After the Saturday Night Massacre, you wondered if our leaders were above the law, and if that were the case, that could be the end of all of our democratic institutions.
A few days after he fired Archibald Cox, President Nixon agreed to surrender the tapes. Leon Jaworski was appointed as special prosecutor, and he proceeded with the work that Cox began. On August 8, 1974, President Nixon became the only president to ever resign from office. On September 8, 1974, President Gerald Ford gave Richard Nixon a full pardon for any crimes he may have committed.
So I spent 7 years working on the Archibald Cox book. I never got tired of it. Cox was an extraordinary figure in American history, not just because of his role in Watergate. He was a direct descendant of Roger Sherman, signer of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He was an early law clerk to the famous Judge Learned Hand, chair of the Wage Stabilization Board under President Truman, labor advisor to a young Senator John F. Kennedy, and then Solicitor General in the Kennedy administration, arguing some of the landmark cases of the 20th century in the Supreme Court, including Baker v. Carr and Reynolds v. Sims, the one-person, one-vote cases, and Heart of Atlanta Motel and Katzenbach v. McClung that upheld the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and other cases. And after that time, after Watergate, serves as chairman of Common Cause, fighting for campaign finance reform and ethics in government. So you can hopefully get a sense, even from that little film clip, that Cox's performance in Watergate was really the culmination of a lifetime of commitment to principle and the rule of law. And I discovered from hundreds of interviews with different people, major figures he had interacted with, that this integrity and principle stuff wasn't a fake for Cox. It was how he had lived his whole life. And nowhere was that more evident than in this dramatic battle for the secret White House tapes. Cox, unlike Congress, was very strategic. You remember watching those Watergate, the Senate Watergate hearings, but they tried to get hundreds of tapes. Cox was strategic and subpoenaed 8 specific tape recordings at specific times and dates that would prove or disprove Nixon's complicity in the Watergate cover-up. Then Attorney General Elliot Richardson, who you saw there, who I got to know quite well, Cox had taught him in Harvard Law School. He told me that he met with Nixon after Cox was appointed, tried to calm him down and reassured him. He said, Archie Cox would just as soon cut off his right arm than do anything improper or politically motivated. And he said Nixon scowled at him from across the table. He didn't buy it. But the truth was Cox did not want a constitutional showdown. He knew there was a legitimate question based upon unsettled notions of executive privilege as to whether he could properly subpoena those tapes. Many scholars at the time, we forget this, but at the time it would have probably been a 50-50 toss-up at best. Most of them would have put their money on Nixon. He had just won a smashing re-election victory in 1972, and the argument would be, why should this special prosecutor or the court's Judge Sirica tell the president that he had to disclose his most private conversations from inside the Oval Office? It was very much an open question. And as tensions mounted, there really was a constitutional crisis looming. Don't forget, Vice President Spiro Agnew suddenly resigned, pleading nolo contendere to accepting bribes in little white envelopes. And so Nixon appointed Gerald Ford as his vice president. Ford was one of the most respected members of Congress at the time. He was the Republican minority leader, was a longtime friend and supporter of Nixon's. And so as the battle for these tapes escalated, federal judge John Sirica ordered Nixon to hand over the tapes. The Court of Appeals affirmed that, and Nixon's White House countered with the so-called Stennis Compromise that was mentioned in the video. Well, you should know that at this time, Senator John Stennis was a 71-year-old senator from Mississippi with hearing problems, 2 hearing aids, who had recently been shot in a burglary attempt. You couldn't make this up. Nixon insisted that Stennis would be the only person who got to listen to the tapes. Cox would then get summaries of the tapes, nothing else, and could not do anything else. It was a bold move, and he was going for broke. Incidentally, I interviewed Stennis's doctor after Stennis passed away for the book. He told me that Stennis was on heavy doses of codeine at this time from his hospitalization, didn't want to do it, but he felt he couldn't say no. I also learned that Nixon had a plan to take Stennis to Camp David by himself, have him listen to pieces of these tapes along with one of his political operatives, and then have him sign off on the summaries. No one else would ever see anything else. So he was taking the ultimate gamble, and he did come close to succeeding. And in fact, he really almost pulled this off when he fired Cox during the Saturday Night Massacre. But there were these consequences, political consequences, that he hadn't banked on. The firing of Cox starts this firestorm of protest. Nixon was forced to allow the appointment of a new independent counsel, Leon Jaworski, who subpoenaed way more tapes. And when the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case in U.S. v. Nixon, that was the final nail in the coffin. The Supreme Court, incidentally, did concede there was such a thing as executive privilege. So Nixon didn't completely lose the case. But they said that principle was sharply limited, and in the Nixon case, it was outweighed by the need for evidence of these tapes in order for the criminal justice system to function properly. To show not just whether Nixon was guilty, but there were a lot of other Watergate defendants. I interviewed Chief Justice Berger in writing this book because he wrote the opinion in U.S. v. Nixon. And he had been appointed by Nixon, and I wanted to ask him, was this really difficult? Think about it, to write the opinion that you know is going to bring down the president who had put you in that position as Chief Justice. And we were sitting in his chambers in the Supreme Court, and I'll never forget, he had his clerk pull down a painting that was hanging behind him on the wall, and it had two law books, two older law books, one red and one brown, and two candles. And he said one book was the volume that contained the trial of Aaron Burr, and the other was the one that contained the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Chief Justice Berger, it turns out, was an accomplished artist. And he told me that when he was in law school at the William Mitchell College of Law, he had been on this moot court team and argued those two cases and painted that painting as a young man. It was hanging behind his head when he wrote U.S. v. Nixon. And those cases for him, stood for the proposition that no one, even the president, is above the law. That's where that whole concept came from. In any event, the White House tapes were damning. They contained the smoking gun, in which Nixon offered to pay $1 million of hush money to cover up the Watergate crime, plus the infamous 18.5 million minute gap you probably remember that was almost certainly a deliberate erasure. So the results of these revelations was that impeachment resolutions were immediately drawn up in the House, but before the House could impeach Nixon, he flew off in a green helicopter, saluted, and became the first president in history to resign in disgrace. So that brings us to another dramatic moment in American constitutional history, and that is President Ford's pardon of Richard M. Nixon. It turned out really to be a scandal within a scandal, because Gerald Ford, who is newly appointed to the presidency after being VP, faces a crisis of his own, and that is what to do with his predecessor, because within days of his taking office on August 9th of 1974, journalists already start peppering him with questions. What are your intentions? Are you going to pardon Richard Nixon? This was not exactly what Ford or any person in that office would be looking forward to in their first week on the job. On one hand, Ford knew that it was crazy to even consider pardoning Nixon. The country had been ripped apart by Watergate, and so by now, Nixon was viewed as a villain by much of the country, even Republican leaders. Ford's top advisor, Bob Hartman, told me that he advised Ford categorically, do not do it. He said, you will be eaten alive by the press. Your own political future, if you decide to run for president on your own in 1976, will be shot to hell if you pardon Nixon. On the other hand, Ford had a real strong sense of what he should do. He was a man who had grown up of very modest origins in the Midwest. He was you may know if you've read about him, the adopted son of a paint and varnish salesman in Grand Rapids who put himself through college on a football scholarship, then went to Yale Law School by coaching football. He was known as honest, square-jawed, straight shooter in the House of Representatives for 25 years. And now Ford had a problem because he believed, and after talking to his wife Betty and a few close friends, believed even more strongly that pardoning Nixon was the only solution. The country had become obsessed by Watergate for nearly 2 years, and if Nixon was criminally prosecuted, Ford felt sure that A, the country would be dragged through the mud for 2 more years of this stuff, and B, perhaps more selfishly, Ford could never get anything accomplished of his own as president. And there was also this issue, which is often overlooked, but is very relevant now, of Nixon's records and tapes. They were sitting in boxes in the old executive office building, and they were gathered up by Nixon's chief aide, General Alexander Haig, who was getting ready to ship all of these off in a plane to Nixon in California. There was a real question at this time, folks, of who owned those records and tapes. Nixon said they belonged to him, but this was key evidence in these Watergate cases. Ford and his closest advisors met with Haig. They decided they had to do something fast, and they were afraid that the records and tapes would, if they went to California, would probably go up in a bonfire, and they were probably right about that. On top of that, there was a big issue if Nixon could receive a fair trial if he was actually prosecuted. I found a secret memo saying that it was virtually impossible, written by Leon Jaworski, for Nixon to get a fair trial, probably for several years. And so Ford anguished over it. He said the records and tapes are staying here, but then he finally decided a pardon was the best thing for the country. And I got interested in this topic because I was fortunate enough to get an interview with President Ford at the Four Seasons Hotel in New York when I was working on the Cox book. And I felt at the time the pardon was a big mistake. Cox felt strongly about that as well. I wanted to hear Ford's explanation for it. And it was just so impressive to me. He was so impassioned talking about it. And I'll never forget, he pulled out his wallet as we were standing there and pulled out this little scrap of paper, and there was a citation written on it for a case called Burdick v. New York from 1915. Now, I had been teaching constitutional law for 2 decades and never heard of it. This case said a pardon is an imputation of guilt. Acceptance of a pardon is an admission of guilt. And Ford told me he had sent his young, trusted lawyer advisor, a guy named Benton Becker, to research how broad his pardon power was. Becker came back and said it's very broad, but then he brought with him this Burdick case. So Ford sent Becker to Nixon's home in San Clemente, in part because no one would know who this guy was. He went secretly to confront the former president with the legal consequences flowing from the Burden case and to work out a pardon deal, and also to work out an arrangement to preserve those records and tapes. So I put together an event for the 25th anniversary of the pardon in 1999. I was able to bring together Benton Becker, who's since passed away, along with Nixon's personal lawyer, Herbert Jack Miller, and others, and they all confirmed that this story was true. And in fact, Jack Miller made public for the first time, with permission of the Nixon family, that Richard Nixon had tried not to accept the pardon at first. He had fought with his lawyer, and they had had vigorous debates about it, and finally his lawyer convinced him to do it. And this is, again, a key point that few people realize, that as part of the deal, Becker was able to get a deed of gift for the records and tapes to hold them in place. And Benton Becker would tell this story so well. I did a number of programs with him, including at Chautauqua, but he would talk about being in that room alone with Richard Nixon. It was chilling. He was essentially there to give Nixon his Miranda rights by telling him, if you accept this pardon, it's an acceptance of legal guilt. He said, he described that Nixon looked hideous. His head, he wrote afterwards, appeared too big for his body, and there were black bags under his eyes. Nixon did not appreciate hearing this blunt legal warning, and after Becker delivered the message, he got up, left, headed to his car to go to the airport. That was it, and Nixon was going to have to decide. And Ron Nesson, if you remember, he had been one of his press secretaries, came running after him, and he said, "Wait, the president wants to see you for another minute." So when Becker went back into this dark room, he said Nixon looked up from the desk and said, "I wanted to thank you. At least you weren't a bully like so many of these other people. I want to give you something, but I have nothing left." And he pointed to the bare walls around this little room. And he handed him a little box, and he said, "This is all I have left to give you." And so Becker took the box. He told me he thought to himself, "I'm getting the hell out of here." He went to the car, headed off for the airport, opened the little box, and it was a pair of presidential cufflinks. That's what Nixon had left. They're now on display at the Ford Museum. I interviewed President Ford at the Ford Museum in Grand Rapids for the 25th anniversary of the pardon in connection with that event at Duquesne. So now I'm going to show you President Ford's explanation of the pardon in his own words. I'm a little younger then. See if you can recognize which one I am.
Good afternoon, President Ford. My name is Professor Ken Gormley, and it's an honor to join you here in the very beautiful Gerald R. Ford Museum in Grand Rapids. As you know, today is the 25th anniversary of your controversial decision to pardon your predecessor in the White House, President Richard M. Nixon. And I have just a few questions as we look back on that event in history. The single issue that seemed to dwarf all others in the eyes of the American public after the pardon was, did President Ford cut a deal with Richard Nixon in advance to pardon him? Can you answer that question directly, Mr. President? Was there a deal of any sort?
I testified before the House Committee on Judiciary that there was no deal, period. I think those are my exact words. And I can assure you, some 25 years later, that there is absolutely no credibility to that allegation. The truth is, I was going to be president without any question of a doubt, because President Nixon was either going to be impeached and forced to resign, or he was going to resign on his own, as he did. So I was going to become president, period, regardless of any comments between him and myself.
And now that you're able to look back on your presidency with the benefit of 25 years hindsight, I ask you this simple question: would you pardon Richard M. Nixon again if you had it to do over?
Well, based on some additional observations, testimony, etc., I think today, if I had to go through the same process with more evidence, I would certainly have executed a pardon on his behalf. There was no doubt when I did it back in September of 1974 that I was doing the right thing, regardless of what the press said, regardless of what many Americans said. It was absolutely, unequivocally the right thing to do for the country. And you had to look at it from that point of view to understand why I took the action that I did.
And did we learn anything more recently from the exhausting and divisive Clinton scandal this past year? Did it shed any light on what the nation might have endured back in 1974 if President Nixon had not been pardoned, but rather subject to a full-blown criminal prosecution?
It would have been an atmosphere in the United States that would have precluded the Congress and my White House from trying to solve the basic problems we had at home or internationally with the Cold War.
So you're as comfortable as we sit here today with the decision as when you sat in the Oval Office 25 years ago today and spoke into the television cameras and granted the pardon?
No question about it. I'm even firmer in my conviction that I did the right thing for the country. And I'm pleased to see that recent polls have indicated that more and more people in America today are agreeing with me than they did 25 years ago.
That's the benefit of history, isn't it?
Right.
Well, thank you very much for sitting down with me today to discuss this historic event.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President.
So does that video change the mind of any of you as to whether the pardon was the right decision for the country? You know, you have to think about it. Would sending Nixon to jail have been better for the country? And I can tell you, Nixon's health was a big factor for President Ford. You may remember he had almost died of phlebitis right around that time. I can also tell you that in the election of 1976 against Jimmy Carter, the pardon was clearly a decisive factor and was part of the reason Ford lost. And does that mean he should have done something differently? As you saw, he told me he would have made the exact same decision, even with more certainty based on what he knew. I remember getting a phone call in my office at Duquesne after this event. It was broadcast nationally on C-SPAN. And my secretary said, "There's a guy on the phone says it's President Ford. Should I hang up?" And I said, "Well, I'll take the call." Well, it was President Ford. And he said that he and his wife Betty and their son Steve had all watched this together. And he was so appreciative because it was important to him. He felt the public, events had just overtaken things, and he felt the public never understood his reasons for the pardon. And before he died, Ford was given the Profiles in Courage Award at the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston, and that meant the world to him. So making decisions like this is lonely business, especially when it involves high-profile presidential scandals. People like Ford and Archibald Cox prepare themselves their whole lives for that moment when the spotlight of history shines down on them. And it was really only for that reason that they had followed a code, a compass their whole lives, that they had the strength to buck the common wisdom and do what they thought was right for the country. So let's talk a little bit about the Clinton scandals. As was mentioned, my Cox book came out just as the Monica Lewinsky scandal was breaking in January of 1998. I found myself being a commentator on special prosecutors, writing op-eds in the New York Times, other papers, appearing on PBS NewsHour. That year I got to be in the amphitheater at Chautauqua. And through luck and good fortune, I end up being the only person in the world to interview all of the key players in the drama. President Clinton 4 times, including twice at his home in Chappaqua, New York. Ken Starr, dozens of interviews. Monica Lewinsky, 50 hours of interviews. Paula Jones, Linda Tripp, Henry Hyde, the House managers, senators on both sides. It was a remarkable experience. And incidentally, I don't often share this story, but we're among friends here in Erie. So I'm going to tell you about my first meeting with President Clinton. It was in the William Penn Hotel in Pittsburgh. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. It was on the top floor in the ballroom, the 17th floor. I was called the day before and said he was willing to meet with me. I was going to pitch the idea of cooperating with this book. He had just left office and published his memoirs and had just signed 1,000 books at a book event. He comes in tired, loosening his tie. They had a table of food about the size of the front of this room, filled with stuff for the two of us. He was on some kind of a new diet, and he looked and was picking around. He said, this crap has mayonnaise, and I can't eat that. And his eyes alighted on this giant plate of French fries, and he said, "Come on, Ken, let's just eat some fries." So we did. We sat, we talked. He agreed to cooperate with us. I went back to my office, literally dancing around my desk. I had landed the President of the United States. 2 days later, my research assistant, Ryan, came in and he said, "Did you hear the news about President Clinton?" I said, "Yeah, he's going to cooperate with my book." He said, "No, he's having quadruple heart bypass." And I said, "Oh my God, the fries, I've killed President Clinton before my interview." But he did, after actually one of his first trips out after he recuperated from his heart surgery, he met with me in Philadelphia. He told me in that first interview that he felt like Wile E. Coyote in the Roadrunner. As soon as he got to the White House, he felt that a group of political opponents were after him. And the selection of Ken Starr as independent counsel clearly only solidified that view for Clinton. Starr was perceived by many people as being a Republican partisan, and regardless, because he had taken public positions on some of these issues in advance, regardless of what you think of Ken Starr, and I thought he was an honorable person and got to know him well, but in my view, he was the wrong person for the job, and I told him that. I thought he was the last person in the world who should have handled this case, especially after it went from the Whitewater case and morphed into Paula Jones and the Monica Lewinsky cases that he had already taken positions on in the media. But let's talk about Clinton's behavior. Was lying under oath in the Paula Jones sexual harassment case grounds for impeachment? I wrote op-eds. Let's take a show of hands. How many of you thought it was grounds for impeachment, his lying under oath? Obviously, the country was split on it. I thought as reprehensible as his behavior was on a personal level, it wasn't what the framers had in mind for impeachment, which was conduct that endangered the well-being of the state. Now, some people would say, but wait, as he's president, so you have to hold him to a higher standard. He can't lie under oath. Well, that always missed the mark for me as a constitutional matter, because he could only be sued. This was people overlook this all the time. He could only be sued as Bill Clinton, private citizen. He would have immunity as president. So you can't have it both ways. And as a private citizen, people are lying under oath all the time. The judges in this room know they don't go to jail. They usually have to lose the case. But in any event, he was impeached by the House based largely on the Starr report for lying under oath and denying the affair. The impeachment failed in the Senate. Why? Well, I remember I was interviewing Clinton at his home in Chappaqua for the first time. It was just before Christmas. I knew he was a late, last-minute Christmas shopper like me, so I arrived with 6 copies of his book to have him autograph them for my wife and all of our kids. And he was autographing these books, and as he's sitting there autographing him, I told him about this 6-foot nun at the Catholic school where my kids went to school, Sister Mary Victor, who had pulled me aside and said, why don't they leave that guy alone to do his job? And I said, Mr. President, I knew once you got the 6-foot nun, there was no way they were convicting you. And he said, do we have another book for Sister Mary Victor? We need to sign a book for her, which we did. So it was the lack of public support, really, that sunk this matter in the Senate. I also believe that he escaped conviction because this isn't talked about much. There was never proof of perjury by a court. Perjury is actually something that you have to find related to a case. Starr had swept in so early in this, there was never an opportunity for Judge Susan Weber Wright to decide anything on that front. In the end, the independent counsel law was allowed to expire in 1999. The country was exhausted. It had cost $42 million for this investigation. Ken Starr, ironically, testified against renewing the independent counsel statute. I testified in the Senate and was one of the last human beings to testify in favor of some version of the law. And I told the Senate committee that I believed that no matter how you did it, you needed to lay out rules for how you were going to do these investigations when there were allegations at the top of the executive pyramid. And indeed, we have needed to have mechanisms ever since. So what's my takeaway about the Trump presidency? Well, when the initial Trump scandals erupted in 2017 and Robert Mueller was appointed as special counsel, it seems like an eternity ago, doesn't it, into the so-called Russia collusion matter, friends said, well, you have to write a book on this. It's a natural for you. Fortunately, I ignored them. I tried to think, I would have been writing a chapter a week. There would be 10 volumes by now if I had set out to write a book on this. But so let's put aside the first 2 impeachments. Let's also put aside the Stormy Daniels matter that led Trump to become the first former president to be indicted, and we can talk about those in Q&A if you'd like. I'd rather focus on the bigger issue. Does the evidence about Trump's direct role in the events of January 6th and in the effort to openly interfere in tallying the votes in Georgia, which we see will probably come to fruition in August, and more recently in hiding, if it's true, highly confidential top secret documents at Mar-a-Lago, does that go so far beyond any presidential or former presidential scandal in history that they may warrant prosecution and even incarceration if crimes are proven? I should begin by saying on that I'm an institutionalist, so I believe in giving enormous deference to any president. I wrote op-eds, as I said, opposing the impeachment of Bill Clinton, but I also wrote op-eds opposing the calls for impeaching George W. Bush, who was a speaker at this society. You may remember there were calls for impeachment when it was turned out that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And I even wrote an op-ed during the first impeachment trial of President Trump, which I attended the first day of, advocating for a bipartisan congressional censure resolution of President Trump as an alternative to further dividing the nation. Incidentally, that wasn't an original idea. That's what Presidents Ford and Carter had recommended in the impeachment of Clinton. Many of my Democratic friends were aghast that I recommended a compromise like that. But January 6th, in my view, and the violence it unleashed was more extreme than any other example one can point to in the span of American history. You got to face the facts. Trump became the first president in an unbroken line of chief executives in America to refuse to accept the results of a presidential election. We saw John Adams may have been humiliated in his loss to Thomas Jefferson, his nemesis. He may have skipped the inauguration, but Adams still cooperated in a peaceful transfer of power. That was the first in an unbroken line of presidents doing that for 220 years. Until Trump's defeat in 2020. Richard Nixon he did go for broke in firing Cox at the Saturday Night Massacre that we talked about, but when the Supreme Court ordered him to turn over the tapes, think about it, he did that. He wasn't happy about doing it, but he understood begrudgingly the importance of separation of powers. And of course, Al Gore could have wreaked havoc if he wanted to challenge the contested election of 2000. He was vice president presiding over the counting of those electoral votes and could have created pandemonium if he wanted. What did he do? He delivered one of the most eloquent concession speeches ever of a vice president and a candidate. If you go through my Presidents in the Constitution book, sadly, there simply is no parallel to Donald Trump's self-inflicted scandals thus far in American history. So to the extent the evidence ultimately shows that Trump was directly involved in engineering or propelling forward the assault on the Capitol and in trying to meddle with the duly counted votes in Georgia and concocting a scheme which is still mind-numbing to me of these fake electors in multiple states, I don't see how prosecutors are going to just look the other way and ignore these things. And incidentally, nor is it persuasive to say that Trump simply believed he had won. Just recently, after Senator Lindsey Graham testified in connection with the Atlanta grand jury probe and the Trump actions, he gave what was framed as a sort of half-humorous comment when he said, well, during that time, if somebody had told Trump that aliens came down and stole Trump ballots, Trump would have believed it. So the kind of clever implication of that was, well, he couldn't have had criminal intent because he just believed that he had won. Well, and the election was rigged and Martians could have stolen the ballots. Well, but stop and think about that. Willful, intentional refusal to accept facts and truth are not a defense. That's like, saying, a bank robber saying, well, I really believe that money in the safe was mine that I blew up. That is not a defense to the bank robbery. So I don't think that, just continuing to deny the outcome of the elections when it has gone to so many courts and there has been no evidence that has demonstrated that the election was stolen in any way, is persuasive, and so that's even more troublesome in my view. I feel similarly, incidentally, about the classified documents allegedly hidden at Mar-a-Lago. If it's true, and the flagrant effort to lie to the National Archives, I mean, these documents do get lost. I've found classified documents in my research on some of these books, but and then you turn them over. I mean, it happens to almost in every case. But when the government asks for something, you don't go and hide it from them. And if that's proven, I think that is a real problem. And incidentally, bear in mind, this records issue simply isn't an open question anymore. Don't forget, President Nixon tried to claim those documents were him. Because of the deal struck at the time of the pardon, those records were frozen in place, and ultimately Congress passed the Presidential Records Act of 1978 to make crystal clear that presidential records belong to the U.S. government, not to individual presidents who are temporary occupants of the office. So, in fact, Congress criminalized the misappropriation of these documents, so that just isn't open to debate anymore. Tragically, I don't see how, if proven, these extreme forms of unlawful behavior are going to be allowed to stand without some consequences. Now, we still have to ask that question, and people haven't talked very much about this, but are there potential compromises that could be struck for the good of the country, short of incarcerating a former president to avoid unleashing more strife and chaos? One option, in my mind, that can have a certain appeal might be to strike a deal by which former President Trump could agree to a suspended sentence or to a minor criminal count in return for an agreement that he would be barred from running for or holding public office again. I think the principal concern of the Justice Department is that if he got the keys to the White House again, he could further erode the constitutional system. And so it makes sense in theory. I seriously doubt, though, that such agreement could ever be reached, at least until after Trump was convicted and facing some serious jail time or some consequences. I just otherwise can't imagine that he would agree to it. I know that some of you may be sitting there and thinking, well, this is outrageous, though. If I did these things, I would go to jail. Trump should have to be accountable like everyone else. And that's a very fair position to take. But presidents and the Justice Department have to make judgments about the wisest way to handle impossible situations all the time as President Ford said, for the good of the whole country. And incidentally, they did that. I don't know if you remember this, at the end of the Clinton presidency. He agreed to a 5-year suspension of his law license and a fine of $25,000 to end the criminal prosecution that had been started by Ken Starr. So the best outcome for the country isn't necessarily to gain a conviction or jail time. Even when you're talking about reckless behavior of a former official, the more pressing priority may be to prevent an eruption of discontent and violence, even if it's unwarranted, and safely steering the country at a time of volatility. The question, I think, and I'll end on this so we can have a discussion, but the question I think we need to be asking ourselves right now, and I mean all of us on every side of the political divide, is a question that Archibald Cox told me he worried about constantly during Watergate. And that question was, what happens if I go too far? What happens to the presidency? What happens to the courts? What happens to our system of laws? In the end, Cox reminded himself, even during the darkest days of this Watergate scandal, even the demise of a president or the mortal wounding of one isn't worth it if we destroy what we've spent over 200 years building up. When Cox agonized over his own standoff with President Nixon over those tapes, to the point he admitted to me he almost accepted a secret compromise on the eve of the Saturday Night Massacre by which he would give in to a large extent to some of this stuff to avoid a direct constitutional crisis. He told me he was haunted by a passage from the Robert Bolt's play, A Man for All Seasons, that he couldn't shake out of his mind. The line went, "And when the last law was down and the devil turned round on you, where would you hide, the laws all being flat?" And the answer delivered in the play always stuck with Cox. "Yes, I'd give even the devil benefit of the law," the passage ended, "for my own safety's sake." So Cox struggled mightily with this moral quandary, but he ultimately concluded that at some point, as tough as it is, even the devil has to be held to account, or our democracy will be doomed to a downward spiral that may be irreversible. Unfortunately, we may find ourselves facing a similar quandary as a nation, and in the end, our system of laws and justice can't survive unless at some point we say enough, even if it's a president or a former president who openly defies the law that applies to everyone else. But we have to be very careful. We have to assess the entire picture based on all of the facts and the law, and not just on our emotions or personal preferences. One thing I am certain about as we sit here together in this beautiful hall talking about this subject, that 100 years from now, because you all care about history, historians will look back and view this as a pivotal moment in the life of our nation. And whatever path we take here, we're going to have to live with it long after all of us are here. We're going to face a decision point, obviously, in the 2024 elections, but we're going to continue to face that decision point in the months and the years that follow. In the end, I am an optimist, like Archibald Cox was, and I will put my money on the fact that there are enough good, clear-thinking people in our country, including people in this auditorium and places around it, like the country, who are going to get it right. So thank you very much for the honor of joining you this evening.